Before we go over the Blender interface, I wanted to show you all an initial resource in Canvas. So if you go to the Files section in Canvas, you'll notice there's a part here called Old Course Files. It's also outlined here. And then there's something called Lecture Notes. These are old lecture notes from previous semesters, but what you might find is helpful is downloading different ones and using it as a way of creating your own lecture notes. So for instance, the next section we're going to be going over the Blender interface. So you might want to download this, and then as we go over certain parts, you might want to highlight them. Blender is very keyboard shortcut intensive. All 3D modeling software are. So there's going to be a fair number of keyboard shortcuts that you're going to learn over the course of the semester. So to help that process, you might want to highlight those too. If you ever forget them, you can jump and look at your notes. All right, so let's go back to Blender. When we first open Blender, you'll get that default screen. Let me actually go ahead and reset this. There we go. So this is exactly what you'll see when you first open up Blender. It's really critical to not click around in here and not hit any keys until we get a couple things set up. So if you accidentally do, go ahead and either do what I just did and reset the default scene by making a new file, or just quit out of Blender and reopen it. But first, we're going to go ahead and need to set up some preferences to make sure that we're all using Blender in the same way. As the semester goes on and you get more comfortable with it, obviously you can customize the preferences. So first go to File, and then down to User Preferences. And we're going to go ahead to the Input tab. It'll probably default to Interface. So go click on Input up here, and you'll want to check Emulate 3-button mouse. So mine is defaulted to being checked, that's fine. And then you'll also want to check Emulate numpad. So again, if it defaults to it, that's great. Just go ahead and leave it as it is. Then you're going to want to save these as your user settings. So go ahead and click this, and then you can close this window. All right, so now we have this set up and it's ready for our use so that we're all using it in the same way. So let's take a look at what these different panels are, because Blender can look pretty confusing. I'm just going to reorganize this. I'll show you how to do this in a minute so we can see what we're working with. So up here, this bar is called the information bar. And every single window, this is actually made up of a series of different windows, you can customize and change based on what's appearing in this icon. So if I click on this tiny little eye, you can see that I actually have a whole bunch of different window options in here, and it's set to info. In fact, if I scroll down on this, you get like this sort of scary line of code. Don't worry about that. But normally this is defaulted to the top of the bar, and you can just leave it there. You have the file here and some other tools that we'll come into later on. This also tells us which kind of working mode we're using. So we're in the default working mode, but you can see that there's different window layouts for animation, which radically changes the screen layout, game logic if you want to get into it, but we're going to stay in the default mode pretty much for the whole semester. All right, so the next big window you want to concern yourself with is the 3D viewport, or the 3D object mode. So that is this entire window right here. Now this looks like another window. This is actually a tab that we can scroll in, and I'll show you guys a little bit more about that in a minute. But this whole window is your 3D viewport. And this down at the bottom is actually the bar that gives us information for this window. You can toggle these bars by control clicking on them. Let's see if I can get it to control click. There we go. And you can say flip to top. So I just noticed that this changed a little bit. Depending which version you're using, it's either control click, or it's control, or it's just right click. Nope, it's changed it. See, my lecture notes are already out of date. So you can right click it and flip it to the top if you want to. I recommend, just for the sake of consistency, keeping these window layouts the same for now. All right, so this is your 3D viewport. Again, we can change what kind of window this is in this information bar, and right now it tells us it's the 3D view. Now the 3D viewport has another way to customize how we can work in here, and right now this is set to object mode. We're going to be working in object mode for the next couple videos, actually this entire module, but later on we'll get into the edit mode, sculpt mode, weight painting, and so on. All right. The next window we're going to see is this timeline. The timeline we won't get to until the very end of the semester, but this is a timeline just like a video or animation timeline. It works in terms of frames. So right now its active area is 250 frames long. And again, if we click on this widget here, you can see that it's set to timeline. The next one up here is the outliner. Let me clean this up a little bit. There we go. This outliner will show us everything in the scene. So we have the camera, and you can actually click on objects in here. I'm left clicking on them to activate those objects. So notice this is highlighted gold now. That means that's a selected object. If I click on the cube, that's selected, and if I click on the lamp, that's selected. In each of these objects, you can also scroll down and see certain properties for it, which we'll get into much later on. You'll also see that you can hide them. So if I want to shy that cube, you can make it so that we can't click on it, and you can make it so that you can't render it. And again, we'll come back into those later on. The next section here are the properties. So the properties give us a lot of different information about the scene. They're also contextual based off of what's selected in the window. So if I right-click on this cube, so I right-clicked on that. If you left-click, you reset your 3D cursor. We'll talk about that in the next video. But if I right-click on this cube, you can see that I have a series of tabs that become visible and give me information about that cube. Whereas if I right-click on the camera, you can see that this tab just changed, and now I have camera information. Or if I right-click on the light. So these properties will change depending on what you have selected in the scene. And there are all kinds of really wonderful things that we'll get into in there. All right, so that's basically it for setting up Blender and the interface. In the next video, we're going to get into navigating the scene and looking around at things. See if I can quit out of here. Whoa.